I grow a lot of tomatoes, and I've grown tomatoes for about 30 years. Along the way, I've made a ton of mistakes. Join me today as I share with you 10 of the most common mistakes gardeners make when growing tomatoes. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I grow a lot of tomatoes. It's one of my favorite plants to grow in the garden. In this long bed of tomatoes, I'm growing 9 different varieties. Every year I try something new, but for the most part, I stick with the varieties that I know do well in my garden. And this year, I'm growing only indeterminate tomatoes. And that's the first mistake that a lot of gardeners make, not understanding the difference between determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. I like coming out to the garden and having a variety of harvest when all of these tomatoes begin getting ripe. Indeterminate tomatoes grow as a vine, and the fruit ripens at different times. So lower on the plant, you'll have some ripe fruit, and as the plant grows, it'll set new flowers and new fruit, and that will ripen in time. And the process continues as the plant grows, adding more tomatoes that ripen at a different time than the first ones. Determinate tomatoes tend to grow more like a bush. They won't get as tall as the indeterminate tomatoes. The determinate bushy tomatoes will set their flowers and their fruit pretty much all at the same time, within just a couple weeks of each other. And all of that fruit will ripen at pretty much the same time. And this is where the mistake comes in. A lot of gardeners are growing tomatoes wanting to make sauce. Well, indeterminate tomatoes, because of the irregular ripening, will give you a few one day and a few the next day and a few the day after that. But if you want a lot of tomatoes all at once, it's determinate varieties that you should be looking for. Another common mistake a lot of gardeners make is over-fertilizing their tomatoes. I've been enjoying the cherry tomatoes off of these plants for a couple weeks now. They're delicious. Sun Gold just can't be beat. In this bed, I've applied 0 fertilizer this year. At the end of last year, I amended my soil with a lot of good organic matter. I know the soil is filled with nutrients because of my amendments, and I don't need to fertilize. But what happens is, by applying the fertilizer on a regular schedule that you'll often see recommended, the soil can become too rich in nitrogen. And too much nitrogen will cause beautiful tomato plants, all green, but without any of these beautiful fruit developing. Too much nitrogen is probably the reason why you're not getting the tomatoes on your plant. So, work with your soil, amend the soil, make it rich, and stay away from over-fertilizing. Another common mistake is not planting other plants in the same bed as tomatoes. These are companion plants to tomatoes. They all use about the same amount of water, and they use the same nutrients from the soil. So I can grow tomatoes in one part of the bed up high, and in front of them, this whole area is filled with jalapeno pepper plants, and this area is filled with onions, and along the sides and in between, I'm growing cilantro. You can just grow tomatoes by themselves in a bed, but why not take advantage of the space in between the plants and grow other crops that you want? As long as they have similar nutrient needs and similar water needs, there are many plants you can grow in the same bed as tomatoes. I also love growing basil with my tomato plants. So this is my salsa garden bed, which is why they're all growing together. I can come out, harvest everything at the same time, and make salsa. In my other beds where I'm growing basil and tomatoes, same thing. I can harvest some fresh basil leaves and tomatoes at the same time and go in and enjoy a caprese salad that just can't be beat. Gardeners often plant their tomatoes too close together. Now I have 9 different varieties here, but some of these varieties I have 2 or 3 plants in this space. Even though it looks like it's a wall of tomatoes, I've given each plant enough space so it can grow. I have a plant right here, and 18 inches to the side is another plant, and 18 inches to the side is another plant, and 18 inches to the side is another plant. And I followed this same spacing with a plant and a plant and 1.5 feet between these plants all the way down this row. You'll see on seed packets and in gardening books that you should plant tomatoes 2 to 3 feet apart. Well, that's because they'll sprawl. And so if you just let them sprawl in a garden space, you're going to need a lot more space. And the next common problem is not trellising. The reason I can put my plants only 18 inches apart is because I'm growing vertically. I'm growing these tomatoes on a trellis up. So while some of the branches are moving forward and sprawling over the edge, the bulk of the plants are growing up, which allows me to put more tomatoes into a given bed. The type of trellis really doesn't matter. I'm using a Florida weave trellis in this tomato bed. I'm using this high cattle panel hoop as a trellis in this bed. All the different types of trellises I use are purely to get the vertical growing of these plants and to allow the entire plant to be exposed to sunlight. And that's the next common mistake, is planting the tomatoes where they get too much shade. The tomato plants should get at least 6 hours of sun a day, but I don't think that's really enough. You should really strive to get closer to 8 to 10 hours of full sun. And that's why all of my beds are oriented to get the sun. Without enough sun, the tomato plants are probably going to be stunted. They're going to set fewer flowers. They're going to have less fruit. And that fruit may take longer to ripen. You want as much sun as possible with your tomato plants. So take the time and be selective in where you put your plants. If you can't have a nice bed like this in the sun, well, consider growing your tomatoes in containers that you can move around and take advantage of wherever the sun is in your garden. Another mistake that I was guilty of for quite a few years was not planting cherry tomatoes. You think of tomatoes as the nice big slicers that you might buy at the supermarket or farmer's market, and that's what a lot of new growers start with, the big tomatoes. But for many of us who have a short growing season like I do in my Colorado garden, I can't grow those big tomatoes, and it took me a few years to figure that out. Instead, I have great success with cherry tomatoes. Cherry tomatoes are always the first to ripen in my garden. They're the first ones that I harvest, and because I'm growing on indeterminate plants, they keep producing all season long, to the point that I've got cherry tomatoes coming out my ears. The flavor options with the hybrids and the heirlooms that you can grow are just boundless. So consider growing cherry tomatoes. Some of the yellow and gold varieties like the Sun Gold and the Sun Sugar and the Lemon Drop that I've reviewed in other videos for their amazing flavor. But also just grow them because it's something that will do well in most gardens. The next mistake is waiting until the tomatoes are completely and fully red before harvesting. Now, first off, there are a lot of tomatoes, as you've already seen, that aren't red. The key point here is tomatoes, once they reach their mature size and once they begin ripening, you can harvest them and they will continue to ripen off the plant and even inside your house. These black crim tomatoes have reached the size that they'll be at harvest. And this one is just starting to change color from a dark green to having shades of light green and red. Even these smaller ones I could harvest now and expect that they will continue to ripen off the plant. This is important for a few reasons. First off, if you have a problem with birds or other animals that keep stealing your tomatoes before you can harvest, well, just consider harvesting early and then letting the tomatoes continue to ripen in a nice location that those animals can't get to. Also, at the end of the season, when the frost threatens, so many of us just leave the tomatoes on the plant and say, oh, that's too bad, the freeze came, I lost my tomatoes. No, harvest those green tomatoes and allow them to ripen. And even for the ones that aren't mature enough to ripen, there are still a lot of recipes out there that you can use green tomatoes in. Great flavor as a green tomato or as a ripe tomato. Just try to avoid leaving them on the plant if you can. Another common mistake is thinking that heirloom tomatoes are something special and completely different than other types of tomatoes. You'll go to a restaurant and order an heirloom tomato salad that tastes really good. And usually it's because heirloom tomatoes will taste better than what we get at the supermarket. But all an heirloom is a variety that has some history behind it. Usually a variety that's been grown for at least 50 years. It's an open pollinated type of tomato, which means you can save the seeds and grow the same plant year after year. But there are many other open pollinated tomatoes that aren't heirlooms. And there are many other hybrid tomatoes that taste great too. It all comes down to the variety when you're looking at the flavor, the color, and the size. So while I grow a lot of heirlooms, some of these are hybrids because I'm after the color and the flavor and the size, and I choose what works best in my garden, whether it's an heirloom, another open pollinated variety, or a hybrid. A common mistake that many gardeners make is not regularly amending your soil. I'm often asked, can you grow tomatoes in the same bed year after year? Well, absolutely. I grew tomatoes in this bed last year. They look great this year. I'll grow in this bed again next year. I built this bed specifically for growing my tomatoes. If I didn't amend the soil, well, these plants would rob nutrients from the soil, and after a couple years, they wouldn't look so good. But by amending and keeping my soil alive and packed with those nutrients, I can keep growing in the same beds year after year. I don't have diseases in my plants, so I don't have to worry about those diseases being passed on year after year. If you have a problem with disease, then yes, you might want to rotate where you grow your tomatoes. But just keep your plants healthy. Keep them growing in healthy soil. And as I already pointed out, that means you don't even need to use fertilizer. And if you do that, you can keep growing year after year in a spot that's ideal for tomatoes. If you want to learn more about growing tomatoes and the tomatoes I grow, watch one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.